This aircraft isn't for people like you, sweetheart. Catering deliveries go around back through the service entrance. Captain Jake Morrison didn't even glance up from his iPad as he dismissed the woman standing at the base of the silver stairs leading up to the Gulfstream G700. His voice carried the casual arrogance of a man who had never been questioned, never been challenged, and certainly never been wrong. At least, that's what he believed. The October morning air at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey was crisp and expensive, filled with the quiet hum of private jets that cost more than most people's houses. This wasn't where you caught a crowded commercial flight to visit your grandmother. This was where the 0.1% came to disappear into the clouds on metal birds worth more than small countries. Zara Mitchell stood perfectly still at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, her weathered leather briefcase in one hand, boarding pass in the other. At 34, she wore dark jeans that had seen better days, an oversized navy blazer that hung loose on her frame, and simple black flats that made no sound on the tarmac. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore no jewelry except for a plain silver watch that had belonged to her father. She looked like a million things: a tech startup employee, a graduate student, someone's assistant. What she didn't look like, at least to Captain Morrison, was someone who belonged anywhere near a $75 million private jet. Morrison finally lifted his eyes from his screen, his aviator sunglasses reflecting Zara's calm expression. He was exactly what central casting would order for an arrogant pilot, tall, silver-haired, with a jawline that had probably charmed flight attendants for 2 decades, and an attitude that had definitely gotten him in trouble with more than a few passengers. "I said deliveries go to the back." Morrison repeated, his tone sharper now. "This is a private charter operation. We don't have time for whatever you're selling." Behind him on the stairs, Maria Santos shifted uncomfortably. The 29-year-old flight attendant had been working private aviation for 3 years, long enough to recognize the tone Morrison used when he'd already made up his mind about someone. She'd heard it before, usually directed at passengers who didn't fit his narrow definition of what wealth looked like. Maria clutched her service manual tighter, the weight of her own secrets heavy in her chest. She needed this job. Her daughter Sophia's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. "I'm not delivering anything," Zara said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm flying to Miami. Z. Mitchell." She held up her boarding pass, the paper crisp and official. Morrison's co-pilot, Brad Wilson, appeared at the top of the stairs. At 31, Brad had been flying with Morrison for 2 years, long enough to learn that questioning the captain's judgment was a quick way to end your career. Brad had his own student loans to worry about and a mortgage that kept him awake at night. He watched the interaction below with growing unease but said nothing. Morrison snatched the boarding pass from Zara's hand, examining it like a detective studying evidence at a crime scene. "Deadhead passenger," he muttered, then looked at her again with obvious disdain. "Corporate charity case. Excuse me." Zara's eyebrows rose slightly. "Look, lady, I don't know what strings you pulled or whose diversity quota you're filling, but this is a professional operation. We maintain certain standards here." Morrison's voice carried across the private aviation terminal, loud enough for the ground crew to hear, loud enough for the maintenance workers to stop what they were doing and watch. Among those watching was Dylan Rodriguez, a 24-year-old ground crew supervisor who had been working the early morning shift. Dylan had seen his share of entitled passengers over the years, but he'd also seen enough discrimination to recognize it when it was happening right in front of him. He pulled out his phone, not to record, not yet, but ready. "What standards would those be?" Captain Zara asked. Morrison stepped closer, his presence imposing. At 6'2", he towered over Zara's 5'5" frame, but she didn't step back. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply waited. "The standard that says when you're flying on my aircraft you dress appropriately, you act appropriately, and you sure as hell don't show up looking like you just rolled out of bed." Morrison's words were calculated, designed to humiliate. "This isn't public transportation, sweetheart. This is first class all the way, and frankly, you don't look like you've ever seen first class, let alone belong in it." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Maria Santos felt her stomach twist. Brad Wilson found himself studying his shoes. Dylan Rodriguez's thumb hovered over his phone's record button. But Zara Mitchell just smiled. It wasn't a big smile, wasn't theatrical or defiant. It was the quiet smile of someone who knew something nobody else knew. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated their entire life and had learned to turn that underestimation into their greatest weapon. "I understand your concern about maintaining standards, Captain Morrison," she said, her voice calm as glass. "I'll try not to disappoint." Morrison's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to passengers who didn't either argue back or shrink away from his authority. This woman's composure was unsettling, like she was operating from some script he didn't have access to. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew except for a handful of lawyers and executives scattered across 3 time zones, was that 48 hours earlier, Zara Mitchell had completed the largest acquisition in private aviation history. Her company, Quantum Aviation Holdings, had purchased Atlas Elite Airways in a deal worth $2.3 billion. The ink on the contracts was barely dry, and the public announcement wasn't scheduled until the following Monday. More importantly, the aircraft they were standing next to, with its gleaming silver fuselage and tail number N847QA, wasn't just another plane in the Atlas Elite fleet. It was Zara's plane. She owned it. She owned the fuel in its tanks, the leather in its seats, and technically, she owned the paycheck that Morrison wouldn't be receiving much longer. But Zara wasn't here as an owner conducting a public inspection. She was here as Z. Mitchell, listed on the manifest as a deadhead passenger, which was airline terminology for an off-duty employee or company representative traveling for business purposes. It was a designation that allowed her to observe how her new company operated when they thought no one important was watching. What she was watching was Morrison's true character. And she was taking notes. Maria Morrison called up the stairs without taking his eyes off Zara. "Get down here and check this woman's credentials. Make sure everything's legitimate before we let her on board." Maria Santos descended the stairs reluctantly. She'd been a flight attendant long enough to know when something felt wrong, and this felt very wrong. But she also knew that questioning Morrison in front of passengers was career suicide. Her ex-husband's medical bills had already destroyed her credit. She couldn't afford to lose another job. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify your identification," Maria said quietly, her accent carrying just a hint of her El Salvadoran roots. She took Zara's ID with apologetic eyes. Of course, Zara said, her tone kind. She'd noticed Maria's discomfort, filed it away as important information about company culture. While Maria examined the ID, a new voice cut through the tension. "Richie. Baby. I'm here." A blonde woman in her mid-20s came click-clacking across the tarmac on 5-inch heels, designer luggage rolling behind her. Ashley Vanderberg was Morrison's girlfriend, a social media influencer with 50,000 followers who specialized in luxury lifestyle content and had never met a designer label she couldn't pronounce. Ashley, perfect timing. Morrison said, his entire demeanor transforming. Where he'd been cold and suspicious with Zara, he was now warm and welcoming. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Ashley Vanderberg, my guest for today's flight." "Guest?" Zara asked. "She's not on the passenger manifest." Morrison's smile was sharp as a knife. "I added her. Pilot's discretion." Unlike some passengers, Ashley knows how to present herself appropriately for a luxury travel experience. Ashley looked Zara up and down with obvious disdain. "Oh my God, Jake, is she seriously flying with us? I thought this was supposed to be a high-class experience." "Don't worry, babe," Morrison said loud enough for everyone to hear. "She'll be in the back. Won't interfere with our enjoyment at all." Brad Wilson finally spoke up from the top of the stairs. "Captain, shouldn't we check with operations before adding unauthorized passengers?" Morrison's head snapped toward his co-pilot. "Are you questioning my authority, Wilson?" "No, sir. Just following protocol." "I am the protocol at 45,000 feet," Morrison said. "Don't forget that." Zara watched the exchange with interest. Morrison wasn't just discriminating against her. He was creating a toxic environment for his entire crew. This wasn't about one bad interaction. This was about a pattern of behavior that had probably been going on for years. Maria handed Zara's ID back with a small nod. "Everything checks out, Captain?" "Fine," Morrison said, clearly disappointed. He looked at his watch, a flashy gold Rolex that caught the morning sunlight. "But I want it on record that this passenger boarded against my better judgment. Maria makes sure she sits in the crew jump seat. I don't want her contaminating the main cabin." "The crew jump seat?" Zara asked. "For an 8-hour flight, it's what's available." Morrison lied smoothly. "This is a luxury charter. The premium seats are reserved for premium passengers." Dylan Rodriguez had heard enough. He pulled out his phone and opened his social media app. His follower count wasn't huge, maybe 3,000 people, mostly other ground crew and aviation enthusiasts, but he knew right from wrong. And this was wrong. As Zara climbed the stairs behind Ashley Vanderberg, who made a show of pulling her expensive coat closer, as if Zara's presence was somehow contaminating. Dylan started typing. "Watching blatant discrimination happen right now at Teterboro. Private jet captain treating a black woman like garbage while rolling out red carpet for his blonde girlfriend. This is disgusting. Hashtag aviation. Hashtag discrimination. Hashtag wrong is wrong." He hit send, not knowing that his small act of witness would soon become part of a much larger story. Inside the aircraft, Zara got her first look at the interior she now owned. The Gulfstream G700 was a work of art with cream-colored leather seats arranged in a club configuration, polished wood accents, and carpet so thick it felt like walking on clouds. The main cabin could seat 14 passengers in absolute luxury, with each seat converting to a fully flat bed. There was a full galley, a private suite in the back, and technology that allowed passengers to stay connected anywhere in the world. It was beautiful. It was also currently being contaminated by Morrison's toxic leadership. "This way, Ma'am Maria said softly, leading Zara past the empty luxury seats toward the back of the aircraft. The crew jump seat was a small hard chair next to the lavatory designed for flight attendants during takeoff and landing, not for passengers on transcontinental flights. 8 hours in this, Zara asked, more curious than complaining. Maria's eyes were apologetic. "I'm sorry, Captain's orders." Zara sat down, testing the thin padding. "It's okay, Maria. Not your fault." But as she settled into the uncomfortable seat, Zara pulled out her phone and opened her encrypted messaging app. She sent a quick text to her head of legal test flight in progress. "Document everything. We're going to need a full crew review." The response came back immediately. "Understood. Legal standing by." Morrison's voice boomed from the cockpit over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Atlas Elite Airways flight to Miami. Weather looks good, flight time approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes. Ashley champagne service will begin as soon as we reach cruising altitude." Zara noticed he didn't mention her in the welcome. She also noticed that he'd promised champagne service to Ashley but hadn't mentioned any service for the listed passenger. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was a violation of basic hospitality standards that could be documented and used as evidence of discriminatory treatment. As the engines began to spool up and the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Zara settled in for what she knew would be an educational flight. She was about to learn exactly what kind of company she'd purchased and exactly what kind of changes needed to be made. What she didn't know was that 50 miles away, a 22-year-old Hispanic social media influencer named Jordan Martinez was boarding his own flight at a different airport. Jordan had 2.3 million followers on TikTok, a platform he used to call out injustice wherever he found it. Dylan Rodriguez's post about discrimination at Teterboro had just crossed Jordan's timeline. And Jordan Martinez never ignored injustice. The stage was set. The players were in position. And in the next few hours, Captain Jake Morrison was about to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who holds your entire future in their hands. The Gulfstream G700 lifted off from Teterboro Airport with the smooth power of 17,000 pounds of thrust per engine, climbing through the morning sky like a silver bullet aimed at the heart of American aviation culture. Inside the aircraft, the contrast between the front and back cabins was becoming more pronounced by the minute. In the main cabin, Ashley Vanderberg had kicked off her designer heels and spread herself across two of the cream leather seats like she owned the plane. Morrison had emerged from the cockpit, leaving Brad Wilson to handle the initial climb while he played host to his girlfriend. "Baby, this is incredible," Ashley squealed, running her manicured fingers over the hand-stitched leather. "Is this what you get to fly every day?" "Only when I'm flying VIPs," Morrison said, his chest puffed with pride. "This is the crown jewel of the Atlas Elite Fleet. $75 million of pure luxury." From her cramped position in the crew jump seat, Zara listened to every word. Morrison had the aircraft valuation wrong. It was actually $77.2 million after the custom interior modifications she'd reviewed during the acquisition. But she wasn't about to correct him. She was too busy watching him violate company policy by leaving the cockpit during the critical climbing phase. Maria Santos appeared from the galley carrying a silver tray with crystal champagne flutes and a bottle of Dom Perignon. The champagne alone cost $400, and company policy clearly stated that premium alcohol was reserved for paying passengers on charter flights, not for crew members' personal guests. Dom Perignon, 2015. Morrison announced grandly as if he'd personally vinified the grapes. "Only the finest for my lady." Ashley clapped her hands together. "Oh my God, this is so much better than first-class commercial. Jake, you're spoiling me." "Nothing's too good for you, babe," Morrison said, popping the cork with a theatrical flourish. Foam spilled onto the Italian leather, which Morrison ignored, even though the cleanup would cost hundreds of dollars in specialized cleaning. Zara pulled out her phone and discreetly began recording. Morrison consuming premium inventory meant for passengers while neglecting basic crew protocols was exactly the kind of evidence she'd need for the comprehensive review that was coming. While Morrison poured champagne for Ashley, his phone buzzed with a notification. Dylan Rodriguez's social media post was starting to gain traction, picked up by other ground crew members and aviation workers who recognized the behavior he was describing. But Morrison was too distracted by Ashley's praise to notice the growing storm brewing online. Meanwhile, 40 miles away at Newark Airport, Jordan Martinez was settling into his own first-class seat on a commercial flight to Los Angeles. Jordan had built his massive TikTok following by documenting injustice wherever he found it, from retail discrimination to workplace harassment. His followers knew that when Jordan started filming, something important was happening. Jordan's phone was blowing up with notifications about Dylan's post from Teterboro. The story was simple, but infuriating. Private jet captain treating a black woman like garbage while rolling out the red carpet for his white girlfriend. Jordan knew discrimination when he saw it even secondhand. He opened his camera app and started recording. "Okay, my followers, we need to talk about something that's happening right now in New Jersey. A ground crew member just posted about watching a private jet captain literally discriminate against a black woman passenger while treating his white girlfriend like royalty." Jordan held up his phone showing Dylan's original post. "This is Dylan Rodriguez, works ground crew at Teterboro. Says he watched this captain tell a black woman that the aircraft isn't for people like her and forced her to sit in the crew seat while his girlfriend gets champagne service in first class." The comments started flooding in immediately. This is 2024. Get her name. Someone call the news. This can't be legal. I'm about to take off myself, Jordan continued. But I'm going to stay on this story. This is exactly the kind of behavior that needs to be called out. If you're watching this, share it. Let's make sure this captain knows the world is watching. Jordan's video had 50,000 views before his own plane even pushed back from the gate. Back on Morrison's flight, the discrimination was escalating. Ashley had discovered the aircraft's entertainment device and was blasting pop music loud enough to be heard throughout the cabin. Morrison not only allowed it, but encouraged it dancing awkwardly in the aisle while Maria tried to prepare the galley for meal service. Maria Morrison called out, "Bring us the caviar service, the good stuff from the owner's private stock." Maria hesitated. "Captain, the Osetra caviar is marked for owner use only. Company policy states, I am company policy at altitude." Morrison cut her off. "The owner isn't on this flight. What he doesn't know won't hurt him." Zara raised an eyebrow at the pronoun usage. Morrison assumed the owner was male, which wasn't surprising given his obvious biases. She watched Maria reluctantly retrieve the $300 tin of caviar from the locked galley cabinet, her face showing clear discomfort with the captain's orders. "And make sure our economy passenger in the back doesn't get any ideas about premium service," Morrison added loud enough for Zara to hear. "Deadhead passengers get standard crew meals. If she's lucky." Ashley laughed a sharp sound that cut through the cabin air. "Deadhead passenger. Is that what they call charity cases?" "Something like that," Morrison said. "Corporate does these diversity things makes us carry passengers who don't really belong. It's all about optics." From the crew jump seat, Zara continued recording. Morrison's casual racism was providing a masterclass in hostile work environment creation. She made mental notes about the impact on Maria, who was clearly uncomfortable, but felt powerless to speak up. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 45,000 feet, and Morrison returned to the cockpit to relieve Brad Wilson. But he left the cockpit door open, a violation of post-9/11 security protocols, so he could continue socializing with Ashley while maintaining minimal oversight of the flight controls. "Autopilot's engaged," he announced to Ashley. "This thing basically flies itself. I could take a nap and we'd still arrive on time." Zara made another note. Casual attitude toward flight safety combined with protocol violations. The Federal Aviation Administration would be very interested in the video evidence she was collecting. An hour into the flight, the social media storm was intensifying. Jordan Martinez's video had been shared by several celebrity accounts, including a famous comedian with 5 million followers who added the caption, "This is exactly why we need to keep calling this behavior out. Share this story." A former military pilot named Sarah Williams, who happened to be Hispanic and had her own following of aviation enthusiasts, quote, tweeted Dylan's original post. "This is disgusting. What captain, what airline? This behavior has no place in aviation." The hashtag private jet discrimination was starting to trend. Michael Park, a 19-year-old college student who had been at Teterboro Airport that morning for an unrelated reason, found Dylan's post and realized he'd actually witnessed the incident. Michael had filmed Morrison's initial confrontation with Zara through the terminal windows, thinking it looked odd, but not understanding the full context. Now he did. Michael uploaded his video with the caption, "I filmed this morning at Teterboro, and didn't realize what I was seeing. This is the same incident everyone's talking about." The captain was way out of line. The video showed Morrison towering over Zara, clearly being aggressive while she maintained calm composure. It showed Ashley arriving and being greeted warmly while Zara was ignored. It showed the obvious double standard in treatment. Within 2 hours, the combined posts had over 500,000 views. Back on the aircraft, Morrison was oblivious to the growing firestorm. He was too busy playing Lord of the Manor with Ashley while treating his crew like servants and his legitimate passenger like an unwelcome intruder. "Maria, I want the Wagyu beef for lunch," Morrison announced, "and make sure it's cooked properly. Ashley here is used to the finest restaurants in Manhattan." "Of course," Captain Maria replied, but her voice carried a note of resignation that Zara caught immediately. Zara stood up from the jump seat and walked toward the galley. "Excuse me, Maria. Could I get some water?" Morrison's head snapped around. "Did I say you could move around the cabin?" "I need to stretch my legs," Zara said calmly. "It's been over an hour and the jump seat isn't designed for passenger comfort." "The jump seat is what's available," Morrison said. "If you're not comfortable, you should have booked a different flight." Ashley looked up from her champagne. "Seriously, why is she even here? This is supposed to be a luxury experience." "Corporate mandate," Morrison said dismissively. "Sometimes we have to carry passengers who haven't earned their way here. Diversity quotas, charity cases, that sort of thing." The words hung in the air like toxic gas. Maria's face flushed with shame at being forced to witness this treatment. Brad Wilson, visible through the open cockpit door, kept his eyes fixed on his instruments, but his jaw was tight with tension. Zara stood perfectly still, letting the moment sink in. She wasn't angry. Anger would be counterproductive. She was calculating. Every word Morrison spoke was digging his grave deeper. "I see," she said quietly. "And what exactly do you think I need to do to earn my way here?" Captain Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating whisper. "For starters, you could show some respect for your betters. You could recognize that this is a privilege, not a right. And you could remember that some of us have worked our entire careers to get to this level, while others get handed opportunities they don't deserve." "Interesting perspective," Zara said. "Tell me more about what I don't deserve." Morrison was warming to his theme, clearly enjoying what he saw as an opportunity to put an uppity passenger in her place. "This aircraft represents excellence. The passengers who normally sit in these seats have built companies, created jobs, earned their success through hard work and smart decisions. They belong here because they've proven themselves." "And you think I haven't?" "Look at yourself," Morrison said, gesturing at her casual attire. "Look at how you present yourself. Does this look like success to you? Does this look like someone who belongs in a $75 million aircraft?" Ashley giggled from her seat. "He's got a point. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but you do look like you're here by mistake." Zara smiled that quiet smile again. "Mistake. That's an interesting choice of words." What none of them knew was that the social media storm was reaching critical mass. Jordan Martinez's follow-up videos were being shared by major news accounts. A reporter from CNN had picked up the story and was making calls to try to identify the airline and aircraft involved. The TikTok algorithm was pushing the videos to millions of screens across the country. More importantly, people were starting to identify Zara Mitchell. A tech entrepreneur named David Kim recognized her from business conferences and posted, "Wait, is that Zara Mitchell? The woman who sold her logistics company for $800 million? If that's her, this captain has no idea who he's messing with." Another user with connections to the private aviation industry added, "Guys, there was a rumor this week about a major acquisition in private aviation. Someone bought Atlas Elite Airways. If this is that Atlas Elite, and if that's really Zara Mitchell, this is about to get very interesting." The speculation was building, but Morrison remained blissfully unaware, too focused on his power trip to notice that his world was about to collapse. "Maria, I need you to make an announcement," Morrison said, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "I want our passenger in the back to understand the rules for the remainder of the flight." Maria's face showed her internal conflict, but she had no choice. She picked up the intercom handset with trembling fingers. "Attention passengers and crew. Captain Morrison has asked me to remind everyone that this is a luxury charter environment. All passengers are expected to remain in their assigned seats and avoid disrupting the experience of other travelers." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's right. And Maria, make sure our economy passenger understands that meal service is limited. Premium catering is for premium passengers." The cruelty was breathtaking. Morrison wasn't just discriminating. He was humiliating Zara publicly using the aircraft's intercom device to announce his bias to everyone on board. But Zara just sat back down in the jump seat and pulled out her phone again. She had hours of video evidence now. She had witnessed multiple policy violations. She had documented theft of company property and blatant discrimination. More importantly, she had seen enough of Morrison's character to know that this wasn't an anomaly. This was who he was. This was how he treated people he thought were beneath him. This was the toxic culture that had been allowed to flourish in her new company. It was time to start planning the solution. Zara opened her secure messaging app and sent another text to her legal team. Pattern of discrimination confirmed. Hostile work environment documented. Prepare full personnel review for Miami arrival. The response was immediate. Understood. Legal team standing by. Media requests coming in. How do you want to handle? Zara typed back. Let the story build. Don't confirm my identity yet. I want maximum documentation before reveal. Roger that. As the Gulfstream continued its flight south, two parallel stories were unfolding. In the main cabin, Morrison continued his performance of entitled arrogance, completely unaware that millions of people were now watching his behavior and demanding accountability. In the back of the aircraft, Zara Mitchell was quietly building a case that would not only end his career, but transform an entire industry's approach to discrimination and accountability. The reckoning was still hours away, but it was already inevitable. And the best part, Morrison had no idea it was coming. Jordan Martinez posted his third update video breaking news on the private jet discrimination story. People are saying the woman being discriminated against might be Zara Mitchell, the tech billionaire. If that's true, this captain just messed with the wrong person. Stay tuned. This is about to get very interesting. The video got 1.2 million views in 20 minutes. At 35,000 feet, the storm was building, and Captain Jake Morrison was flying straight into it. The Gulfstream G700 began its descent into Miami International Airport as the social media firestorm reached nuclear proportions. What had started as Dylan Rodriguez's simple post about discrimination had exploded into a trending topic with over 10 million interactions across all platforms. News outlets from CNN to TMZ were scrambling to identify the airline and confirm whether the passenger being discriminated against was indeed tech billionaire Zara Mitchell. But inside the aircraft, Captain Jake Morrison remained blissfully unaware of the storm that awaited him. He was too busy enjoying what he thought was his complete dominance over a powerless passenger. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Miami. Morrison announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the smugness of a man who believed he'd successfully put an upstart passenger in her place. Ashley, make sure you're buckled in gorgeous. Our economy passenger should already be secured in her appropriate seat. The jab was unnecessary and cruel, but it perfectly captured Morrison's mindset. In his world, respect was a luxury item that only some people could afford. As the aircraft descended through the clouds, Miami International Airport was buzzing with unusual activity. Word had leaked that a major discrimination incident was about to land at their facility, and the media presence was growing by the minute. News vans lined the perimeter road, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like flowers following the sun. More importantly, Arthur Pendleton, Atlas Elite Airways British Operations Director, was racing across the airport in a black Mercedes, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to manage a crisis he didn't fully understand. "What do you mean the owner is on board?" Arthur was saying to someone on the other end of the call. "Ms. Mitchell isn't scheduled to fly until next week's board meeting." The voice on the phone belonged to Margaret Willis, Zara's personal assistant, and her words sent ice through Arthur's veins. "She's been conducting unannounced inspections of all company assets since the acquisition. She wanted to see how Atlas Elite operates when they think no one important is watching." Arthur's face went white. The passenger manifest shows Z. Mitchell as a deadhead passenger. Morrison wouldn't know. That was intentional. Ms. Mitchell specifically requested to be listed that way to observe authentic company culture. "Arthur, please tell me your captain hasn't done anything inappropriate." Arthur's silence was answer enough. "Arthur, I'm pulling up the social media feeds now." Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, dear God. Oh, no. This is catastrophic." On Arthur's phone screen, Jordan Martinez's latest video was playing confirmed. The woman being discriminated against on this private jet is tech billionaire Zara Mitchell, worth over $2 billion and the new owner of Atlas Elite Airways. This captain just discriminated against his own boss and doesn't even know it yet. The video had 3.7 million views and counting. Arthur's hands were shaking as he connected the dots. Morrison didn't just discriminate against a passenger. He discriminated against the woman who now owned his paycheck, his benefits, his pension, and his entire professional future. "Margaret, I need to contact the aircraft immediately." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "Ms. Mitchell specifically instructed that we let the situation play out. She wants full documentation of how the crew behaves when they believe no consequences are possible. But the media response is enormous. This is international news." "That's the point, Arthur. Ms. Mitchell isn't just addressing one incident. She's creating a moment that will reshape industry standards. Let her work." As Arthur ended the call, his phone immediately rang again. This time, it was Detective Carlos Moreno from Miami-Dade Police Department. "Mr. Pendleton, I'm calling about the aircraft incident that's been reported on social media. We have multiple requests for police presence when your flight lands." "Police presence?" Arthur's voice cracked. "Sir, if even half of what's being reported is accurate, we're looking at potential assault charges, unlawful imprisonment, and federal civil rights violations. I need to know, is this a legitimate situation or social media speculation?" Arthur looked at his phone screen where video after video showed Morrison's increasingly aggressive behavior toward Zara. "Detective Moreno, I believe it's very legitimate, and I believe it's about to get much worse." Back on the aircraft, Morrison was preparing for landing, completely unaware that his career was about to end in the most spectacular and public way imaginable. He strutted down the aisle, checking seatbelts like a king inspecting his domain. "Ashley, baby, you comfortable?" he asked, adjusting her blanket with tender care. "Perfect, Jake. This has been incredible. Way better than commercial first class." Morrison then looked toward the back of the aircraft, where Zara sat in the crew jump seat, still maintaining the quiet dignity that had frustrated him throughout the flight. "You," he said, pointing at her like she was an inconvenient piece of cargo. "I want you off this aircraft first when we land. I don't want you disrupting the disembarkation experience for our real passenger." Zara looked up calmly. "Of course, Captain. Whatever you think is appropriate." Her compliance only irritated him more. Morrison fed off confrontation, off the power that came from making people angry or afraid. Zara's serene acceptance of his abuse robbed him of that satisfaction. "You know what your problem is," Morrison said, moving closer to her seat. "You don't understand hierarchy. You don't understand your place. Some people earn their way to luxury and others get charity tickets. The sooner you accept which category you're in, the better off you'll be." Maria Santos, who had been listening to this escalating abuse for hours, finally reached her breaking point. Her voice was quiet, but carried throughout the cabin. "Captain, perhaps we should focus on landing procedures." Morrison's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me, Did I ask for your input on passenger management? No, sir. I just thought, you're paid to serve drinks and check seat belts, Maria. Not to think about passenger relations. That's my department. The humiliation was complete. Morrison hadn't just discriminated against Zara. He'd created a toxic environment that affected his entire crew. Maria's face flushed with shame and anger, but she had no choice but to accept the abuse. Brad Wilson's voice came through the intercom from the cockpit. Captain Miami Approach is requesting our final passenger count for gate assignment. 3 passengers. 2 crew, Morrison responded. 3, Brad's voice carried a note of confusion. Ashley, me, and the deadhead passenger. Sir, your crew not a passenger. Should I report 2 passengers? Morrison's face darkened. Report what I told you to report, Wilson. 3 passengers. It was a small lie, but it represented Morrison's complete disconnect from reality. In his mind, he and Ashley were the important people on the aircraft. Everyone else, including his own co-pilot and flight attendant, existed solely to serve them. What Morrison didn't know was that every word of this exchange was being recorded by Zara's phone and would soon be evidence in multiple investigations. The aircraft touched down at Miami International, with Morrison's trademark heavy landing more proof of his disregard for expensive equipment and passenger comfort. As they taxied toward the Atlas Elite private terminal, Morrison could see through the cockpit windows that there was unusual activity on the tarmac. Lot of cars out there, he mentioned to Brad. Probably another celebrity arrival. Brad squinted through the windscreen. Sir, those look like police cars. And news vans. Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. Police. For what I don't know, sir. Should I contact ground control? Before Morrison could answer, his phone buzzed with a notification. Then another. Then a flood of them. Years of ignoring social media had left him completely unprepared for the digital age of instant accountability. But Ashley Vanderberg lived on social media, and her phone was exploding with notifications. Her face went from confusion to horror as she scrolled through the feeds. Jake, she said, her voice suddenly small. Jake, you need to see this. Not now, babe. I'm handling the arrival. No, Jake. You really need to see this right now. Ashley held up her phone, showing him Jordan Martinez's latest video. Live update. The private jet is landing in Miami right now. Police are standing by. The captain who discriminated against billionaire Zara Mitchell is about to face justice. This is happening right now. Morrison stared at the screen, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. Billionaire. What? Billionaire. Ashley scrolled frantically through the feeds. Jake, they're saying the woman you've been treating like garbage is Zara Mitchell, the tech billionaire. They're saying she owns the airline. That's impossible, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's just a deadhead passenger. Look at how she's dressed. Look at how she... But even as he spoke, Morrison's certainty was cracking. He thought about Zara's calm demeanor, her complete lack of fear or anger in the face of his abuse. He thought about the way she'd spoken to him, not with defiance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew something he didn't. The aircraft came to a stop at Gate 7 of the private terminal, and Morrison could now clearly see the crowd waiting outside. There were at least 6 police cars, multiple news crews, and what looked like Atlas Elite Airways executives in a heated discussion near the terminal entrance. Arthur Pendleton stood among them, his face pale, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated what was clearly a major corporate crisis response. I don't understand, Morrison said, but his voice was already defeated. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was terrifying. From the back of the aircraft, Zara Mitchell finally stood up. She'd been sitting in that cramped jump seat for nearly 4 hours, documenting every moment of discrimination, every violation of company policy, every display of the toxic culture that had been allowed to flourish under Morrison's leadership. Now, as she walked toward the front of the aircraft, her entire demeanor changed. The quiet, unassuming passenger was gone, replaced by the commanding presence of someone who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "We need to talk." Morrison turned toward her, and for the first time in the flight he really looked at her. Not at her casual clothes or her simple appearance, but at her eyes. They were the eyes of someone who owned rooms, who made decisions that affected thousands of people, who had never needed to prove her worth to small-minded gatekeepers. "You're—" Morrison's voice trailed off. "Zara Mitchell," she confirmed. "CEO of Quantum Aviation Holdings, and as of Tuesday, the majority owner of Atlas Elite Airways." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. His legs actually buckled, and he had to grab the nearest seat to keep from falling. "This aircraft, Captain Morrison Zara, continued tail number N847QA, is worth exactly $77.2 million. I bought it. The fuel in the tanks, I paid for it. The champagne you've been serving to your girlfriend, I own it. Your salary, your benefits, your pension, all mine." Ashley Vanderberg had gone completely silent, her face the color of paper. But more importantly, Zara said, stepping closer to Morrison, "Every single thing you've said and done during this flight has been recorded and documented. Your discrimination, your abuse of company property, your violation of safety protocols, your creation of a hostile work environment, all of it." Morrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For a man who had spent the entire flight talking, he was suddenly speechless. The aircraft door opened and Arthur Pendleton stepped aboard, followed immediately by Detective Carlos Moreno and 2 uniformed officers. "Ms. Mitchell," Arthur said, his voice full of professional mortification, "I am so incredibly sorry. If I had known you were conducting an inspection—" "It's not your fault," Arthur Zara said calmly. "I wanted to see how the company operates when employees think no one important is watching. Now I know." Detective Moreno stepped forward, his presence filling the cabin. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Detective Moreno, Miami-Dade Police. We've received multiple reports about incidents that occurred during this flight. Are you prepared to file formal charges?" Morrison found his voice at last, but it came out as a whisper. "Charges." Zara turned to look at him, and for the first time her expression wasn't calm or understanding. It was cold as winter steel. "Captain Morrison, in the past 4 hours, you have discriminated against me based on my race and appearance. You have verbally abused me in front of witnesses. You have stolen company property for personal use. You have violated federal aviation safety protocols. You have created a hostile work environment for your crew." She paused, letting each accusation sink in. "But worst of all, you have shown me exactly what kind of culture exists in my company when people think there are no consequences for their actions." Morrison's face was now completely drained of color. "Ms. Mitchell, please. I didn't know. If I had known it was you—" "That's exactly the problem." Captain Zara cut him off. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Even the aircraft's environmental devices seemed to have stopped humming. Detective Moreno stepped forward with handcuffs. "Captain Morrison, you're under arrest for assault, creating a disturbance, and potential federal civil rights violations." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Morrison's career, his arrogance, and his belief in his own untouchability ended with a sound that would echo through the aviation industry for years to come. The god of the sky was falling to earth, and everyone was watching. The news of Captain Jake Morrison's arrest spread through the aviation industry like wildfire. Within hours of the Miami landing, every major news outlet was running the story. CNN led with "Tech Billionaire Discriminated Against" on her own private jet. The Wall Street Journal's headline read, "Atlas Elite Captain Arrested After Abusing Company Owner." TMZ, never one for subtlety, went with racist pilot destroys career in 4 hours, doesn't know he's abusing his boss. But the real impact wasn't in the headlines. It was in the boardrooms, crew lounges, and executive offices where industry leaders were having uncomfortable conversations about discrimination, accountability, and the culture they had allowed to flourish in the shadows. At Atlas Elite Airways headquarters in White Plains, New York, emergency board meetings were being called. The company's stock price had actually risen 12% in after-hours trading as investors approved of Zara Mitchell's swift response to discrimination within her ranks. But the real work was just beginning. In Miami, Detective Carlos Moreno was completing the paperwork for Morrison's arrest, while Zara Mitchell sat in the private terminal's executive lounge, finally changing out of the casual clothes that had triggered such vicious discrimination. Ms. Mitchell, Detective Moreno, said the charges we can file immediately include assault for the physical intimidation creating a public disturbance and violation of civil rights under federal transportation law. The Federal Aviation Administration is sending investigators for the safety violations, and the FBI is reviewing potential federal civil rights charges. Zara nodded, but her mind was already moving beyond individual punishment toward structural change. Detective, what I experienced today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a culture that has been allowed to exist because people like Morrison believed there would never be consequences. You want to press all charges. I want to send a message that this behavior will no longer be tolerated anywhere in this industry. Arthur Pendleton approached them carrying a tablet loaded with initial findings from the company's emergency review. Ms. Mitchell, I've been in contact with our legal team and human resources department. The preliminary review is concerning. How concerning? Arthur's face was grim. In the past 2 years, there have been 14 formal complaints filed against Captain Morrison for discriminatory behavior, inappropriate conduct, or creating hostile work environments. All were either dismissed by the previous management or settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. The number hit Zara like a physical blow. This wasn't Morrison's first offense, it was simply the first time he'd been held accountable. 14 complaints, she repeated, and he was still the chief pilot. The previous ownership viewed him as too valuable to discipline. He generated significant revenue through high-profile charter clients, and his seniority made him difficult to replace without cause. Zara's expression hardened. Arthur, I want a full review of every complaint, every settlement, and every manager who chose to protect Morrison instead of the people he was harming. This culture of enabling discrimination ends today. While Zara was building her case against institutional protection of discrimination, Morrison was sitting in a Miami-Dade County jail cell, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his situation. His one phone call hadn't been to a lawyer. It had been to his wife trying to explain how their comfortable life had just imploded. What do you mean you're in jail? Susan Morrison's voice carried through the phone with sharp disbelief. What do you mean you discriminated against the owner I didn't know? Morrison kept repeating. She was dressed like, she looked like, I had no way of knowing. Jake, the news is saying you called her a charity case. They're saying you forced her to sit next to the bathroom while you served champagne to your girlfriend. The word girlfriend hung in the air like poison gas. Susan Morrison had suspected her husband's infidelity, but had never been confronted with it so publicly. Susie, I can explain about Ashley. Don't. Just don't. Jake, our kids are going to see this. Your children are going to watch videos of their father being a racist on national television. How do I explain that Morrison had no answer? In his 22-year career, he had never once considered how his treatment of passengers might affect his family's reputation. He had lived in a bubble where his behavior had no consequences beyond the confines of the aircraft cabin. That bubble had just burst in the most spectacular way possible. Back at the Atlas Elite Terminal, Zara was meeting with Maria Santos, who had requested a private conversation. Maria's hands shook as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ms. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I watched Captain Morrison treat you terribly, and I said nothing. I did nothing." Zara studied Maria's face, seeing not just remorse but genuine anguish. "Tell me why, Maria." "My daughter Sophia has a rare heart condition. The surgery and ongoing treatment cost more than I make in 2 years. I need this job's health insurance. I couldn't risk losing it even when I knew what was happening was wrong." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I've watched Morrison discriminate against passengers before. Hispanic families who couldn't afford first-class treatment, black business executives who were questioned about their tickets, Asian passengers who were spoken to slowly like they couldn't understand English. I saw it all, and I stayed silent because I was afraid." Zara was quiet for a long moment, processing not just Maria's confession, but its implications. How many other employees had witnessed discrimination but felt powerless to speak up because their economic security depended on staying silent? "Maria, what would you have done if you hadn't been afraid I would have stood up for you? I would have reminded Captain Morrison that all passengers deserve respect. I would have refused to participate in discriminatory treatment." Maria's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I would have been the flight attendant my daughter could be proud of instead of someone who stays silent in the face of injustice." Zara made a decision that would reshape not just Maria's life, but the culture of her entire company. "Maria, I'm offering you a position as Director of Crew Training and Passenger Relations. Your job will be to ensure that no employee ever again feels they have to choose between their economic security and doing what's right." Maria's eyes widened in shock. "Ms. Mitchell, I don't understand. You made the wrong choice today, but you made it for the right reasons. You were protecting your child's health. I can respect that even while I work to create a structure where that choice never has to be made. But I failed you. I failed everyone. You were failed by a structure that put you in an impossible position. I'm not just changing individual behavior, Maria. I'm changing the structure that enabled that behavior." While Zara was transforming crisis into opportunity, Brad Wilson was facing his own reckoning. As Morrison's co-pilot, he had witnessed every moment of discrimination but had remained silent out of fear for his own career. Arthur Pendleton sat across from Brad in the company's Miami office, reviewing Brad's personnel file. "You've been flying with Captain Morrison for 2 years, Mr. Wilson. Are you telling me this was the first time you witnessed discriminatory behavior?" Brad's shoulders sagged. "No, sir, it wasn't the first time. How many times, I don't know. Dozens, maybe. Morrison had opinions about certain passengers. He thought some people belonged in luxury aviation and others didn't. And you never reported these incidents." Brad was quiet for a long time. "I have $180,000 in student loans, sir. My wife is pregnant with our first child. Morrison controlled my schedule, my evaluations, my entire career trajectory. Speaking up wasn't just risky, it felt impossible." Arthur nodded grimly. The problem wasn't just Morrison's individual behavior. It was a culture that had concentrated too much power in the hands of senior pilots while providing no protection for those who witnessed misconduct. "Mr. Wilson, Miss Mitchell is implementing immediate changes to our reporting structure. Anonymous reporting devices, protection against retaliation, and clear accountability measures. But the question for you is, what are you going to do with this second chance?" Brad straightened in his chair. "I want to be part of the solution, sir. I want to help build the kind of company where speaking up for what's right doesn't require risking your livelihood. That's exactly what we're going to do." But while Zara was focusing on institutional change, the individual consequences for Morrison were becoming clear. The Federal Aviation Administration had launched an emergency investigation of his pilot's license. The recorded evidence of him consuming alcohol while operating the aircraft was grounds for immediate certificate suspension, even before considering the discrimination charges. FAA investigator Jennifer Walsh reviewed the videos Zara had provided with growing disbelief. In 30 years of aviation safety investigation, I've rarely seen such blatant disregard for basic safety protocols. Captain Morrison violated at least 12 federal regulations during this single flight. The violations included operating an aircraft while impaired, leaving the cockpit unsecured during critical flight phases, allowing unauthorized passengers in the cabin, consuming premium alcohol inventory, and creating a hostile environment that compromised crew effectiveness. Each violation carried significant penalties. Combined, they would result in permanent revocation of Morrison's commercial pilot certificate, effectively ending his aviation career forever. But the legal consequences were just beginning. The Miami-Dade County District Attorney's Office was reviewing charges that could include assault battery, false imprisonment, and violation of civil rights in public accommodation. Federal prosecutors were considering charges under the Civil Rights Act for discriminatory treatment in interstate transportation. Morrison's lawyer, David Steinberg, was blunt in his assessment. Jake, you're looking at potential criminal charges that could result in prison time. The civil liability alone could bankrupt you, and your flying career is over. That's not negotiable. But it was just words, Morrison protested. I never actually hurt her. You physically intimidated her. You forced her to sit in an uncomfortable seat for hours based on her race. You stole company property and violated safety regulations. None of that is just words. Steinberg paused. And Jake, there's something else you need to understand. Ms. Mitchell isn't just pressing charges, she's turning this into a case study for industry reform. This is going to be discussed in business schools and congressional hearings for years to come. Meanwhile, Ashley Vanderberg was facing her own consequences. Her social media career built on luxury lifestyle content was imploding as brands distanced themselves from the discrimination scandal. The same platforms that had made her Instagram famous were now spreading videos of her laughing at Morrison's racist comments. Major brands that had sponsored her content were issuing statements distancing themselves from her behavior. A luxury handbag company that had featured her in campaigns released a statement, "We do not condone discrimination in any form," and have ended our relationship with Ms. Vanderberg effective immediately. Her follower count, once a source of pride and income, was plummeting as people shared clips of her saying, "Does this look like someone who belongs in a $75 million aircraft?" But the most significant change was happening at the corporate level. Zara Mitchell was using Morrison's case as a catalyst for industry-wide reform. She called an emergency meeting of the Private Aviation Leadership Council, a group of executives from the largest private aviation companies in America. The meeting was held virtually, but its impact would be felt across the entire industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Zara began her image crystal clear on screens in boardrooms across the country. What happened on my aircraft this week was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a culture that has prioritized profit over people and enabled discrimination through silence. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation. I've commissioned an independent study of discrimination complaints across private aviation. The preliminary findings are damning. The numbers on the screen told a story of widespread bias. Over 400 formal discrimination complaints filed across the industry in the past 2 years, with resolution rates below 20%. Complaints involving racial discrimination had even lower resolution rates, and most were settled with non-disclosure agreements that prevented public awareness of patterns. We have a choice, Zara continued. We can continue to protect individual bad actors while hoping incidents don't become public. Or we can transform our industry into one that genuinely serves all clients with dignity and respect. She outlined a comprehensive reform package: mandatory bias training for all crew members, anonymous reporting devices with investigation guarantees, zero-tolerance policies for discrimination with termination consequences, and regular auditing of customer service practices across demographic lines. "I'm not asking for voluntary compliance," Zara concluded. "I'm announcing that any company wanting to do business with Atlas Elite Airways or any of my other holdings will need to certify compliance with these standards. This is the new cost of doing business in our industry." The response was immediate and divided. Progressive companies embraced the changes, seeing them as long overdue accountability measures. Conservative executives worried about increased costs and regulatory oversight. But the market response was unambiguous. Atlas Elite Airways' stock price jumped 20% following Zara's announcement as investors recognized that ethical leadership was becoming a competitive advantage in the luxury service industry. 6 months later, the Morrison case had become a landmark in both legal and business education. Harvard Business School added it to their ethics curriculum. Congressional hearings on discrimination in transportation cited it as evidence of the need for stronger federal oversight. The Society of Aviation Professionals established the Mitchell standards as best practices for inclusive customer service. Morrison himself had pled guilty to federal civil rights violations in exchange for a reduced sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation. His pilot's license was permanently revoked, his pension was forfeited to help fund victim compensation programs, and he was required to undergo counseling for anger management and bias awareness. His family paid the heaviest price. Susan Morrison filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and the impossibility of rebuilding their reputation in their community. Their children, ages 14 and 16, had to transfer schools after classmates shared videos of their father's arrest. Morrison now worked in a warehouse in Ohio, loading trucks for $15 an hour. His colleagues knew who he was. The story had been too big to hide, but most treated him with the indifference reserved for people whose moment of consequence has already passed. But the real measure of change wasn't in Morrison's punishment. It was in the transformation of the industry he had disgraced. Maria Santos had become one of the most respected voices in aviation customer service training. Her program, built around the principle that economic security and ethical behavior should never be in conflict, was being implemented across the industry. Brad Wilson had earned his captain's certification and was now flying for Atlas Elite Airways under the new standards, serving as a mentor for other young pilots, learning that true leadership meant protecting all passengers, not just the ones who looked like them. And Zara Mitchell had used her wealth and influence to create lasting change that extended far beyond a single incident on a single aircraft. The culture of silence that had protected Morrison's discrimination for 22 years was broken. In its place was something new: accountability, transparency, and the radical notion that every person who stepped onto an aircraft deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance, their accent, or the assumptions others might make about their worthiness. It wasn't just justice, it was transformation. 3 years after the incident that changed private aviation forever. Zara Mitchell sat in the same aircraft where she had been discriminated against, but everything about the experience was different. The Gulfstream G700 still gleamed with luxury. The cream leather seats, the polished wood accents, the carpet thick enough to lose your shoes in, but the culture surrounding that luxury had been transformed. Captain Roberto Vasquez, a 38-year-old Hispanic pilot who had risen through the ranks under the new merit-based promotion standards, greeted each passenger personally as they boarded. His co-pilot, Sarah Kim, a 29-year-old Korean-American aviator who had been hired as part of Atlas Elite Airways' expanded recruitment program, performed her pre-flight checks with the precision of someone who knew she belonged in the cockpit. Maria Santos, now director of crew training and passenger relations, moved through the cabin with quiet confidence, ensuring that every detail met the company's new standards that measured excellence, not just in service quality, but in respect for human dignity. Ms. Mitchell Roberto said, as Zara settled into her preferred seat, "Weather looks perfect for our flight to Los Angeles today. Flight time should be about 4.5 hours. Thank you, Captain Vasquez, Zara replied, noticing how different it felt to be addressed as a person first, a customer second, and a human being always. The transformation hadn't been easy. In the months following Morrison's arrest, Zara had faced pushback from industry veterans who viewed her reforms as excessive political correctness. Some competitors had initially resisted adopting the Mitchell standards, preferring to maintain existing practices that prioritized wealthy white clients over inclusive service. But the market had spoken decisively. Companies that embraced inclusive practices saw increased customer satisfaction, improved employee retention, and higher profitability. Organizations that resisted change found themselves losing clients to competitors who offered not just luxury, but dignity. The case had become a landmark study in business schools worldwide, taught alongside other examples of how individual courage can catalyze industry-wide change. Students learned about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, then studied Zara Mitchell and the private aviation transformation, understanding how patterns of progress could emerge from moments of personal resistance. But for Zara, the academic analysis missed the most important point. The changes hadn't been about business strategy or market positioning. They had been about a simple principle: every person deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or the assumptions others made about their worth. That principle had roots in her own childhood in Detroit, where she had been told repeatedly that girls like her didn't become tech entrepreneurs, didn't build billion-dollar companies, didn't own fleets of private aircraft. Every teacher who had dismissed her potential, every investor who had underestimated her capabilities, every person who had looked at her skin color and seen limitation rather than possibility, they had all contributed to the quiet strength that allowed her to remain dignified in the face of Morrison's abuse. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Zara said to Arthur Pendleton, who was accompanying her on the flight to Los Angeles for the opening of Atlas Elite Airways' new training center. Arthur, who had become one of her most trusted advisors during the company's transformation, looked up from his tablet. Forgiveness for Morrison. Forgiveness for all of it. Morrison, the structure that protected him. The culture that enabled discrimination to flourish. Zara gazed out the window at the clouds below. "I'm not talking about excusing behavior or avoiding consequences. I'm talking about releasing the anger that could consume you if you let it." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "You've certainly turned that anger into something productive." "It was never really anger," Zara corrected. "It was clarity. Seeing Morrison's behavior so clearly showed me exactly what needed to change. Not just punishing one individual, but transforming the entire structure that made his behavior possible. The results of that transformation were evident everywhere in the new Atlas Elite Airways. The company had become the industry leader, not just in luxury service, but in inclusive excellence. Customer satisfaction ratings had reached historic highs as passengers from all backgrounds experienced genuine hospitality rather than judgment based on appearance. Employee satisfaction had improved even more dramatically. Flight attendants, like Maria Santos, no longer feared reporting inappropriate behavior. Pilots like Brad Wilson, who had been promoted to training captain, could focus on safety and service rather than navigating toxic workplace dynamics. The financial results were equally impressive. Atlas Elite Airways had expanded its fleet by 40%, opened new training centers in 5 cities, and established partnerships with historically black colleges and universities to create pathways into aviation careers for underrepresented communities. But Zara knew the numbers, impressive as they weren't the real measure of success. The real measure was in the stories. Stories like Marcus Williams, a young black entrepreneur who had been nervous about his first private jet experience, but found himself welcomed warmly by a crew that saw his potential rather than his youth. He later credited that flight with giving him confidence to pursue a business venture that now employed over 200 people. Stories like Elena Rodriguez, a Hispanic pharmaceutical executive who had been questioned about her ticket authenticity on other airlines but experienced seamless service with Atlas Elite. She had since become one of the company's highest-value customers and had referred dozens of colleagues who appreciated traveling without experiencing discrimination. Stories like David Park, an Asian-American tech investor who had been spoken to slowly and condescendingly by other aviation crews who assumed he couldn't speak perfect English. On Atlas Elite flights, he was addressed as the brilliant venture capitalist he was leading to business relationships that had generated millions in economic activity. These weren't just customer service victories. They were affirmations of human dignity that had ripple effects extending far beyond individual flights. The legislative impact had been equally significant. Congress had passed the Private Aviation Accountability Act, requiring transparency in discrimination complaint handling and establishing federal standards for crew training. The Department of Transportation had implemented new regulations ensuring that bias training was mandatory for all aviation personnel from pilots to ground crew. International aviation organizations had adopted similar standards, creating a global shift toward inclusive practices in luxury travel. The Morrison case was cited in policy documents from Europe to Asia, becoming a touchstone for how individual accountability could drive institutional change. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Jake Morrison, after serving his sentence and completing mandatory counseling, had written a letter to Zara. She had debated whether to read it, ultimately deciding that understanding his perspective was part of the healing process. The letter was handwritten, clearly difficult for him to write. Ms. Mitchell, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing this letter to make myself feel better. I'm writing it because I need you to know that I understand what I did to you, and I understand why it was wrong. For 22 years, I told myself that I was just maintaining standards, that I was protecting the quality of the flight experience. I convinced myself that my judgments about passengers were based on legitimate concerns about professionalism and behavior. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if I treated everyone equally, if I couldn't maintain the illusion that some people were more deserving of respect than others, then I would have to confront my own insecurities about whether I deserved my position. I grew up poor, Ms. Mitchell. My father worked 3 jobs to pay for my flight training, and I was terrified every day that someone would figure out that I didn't really belong in the cockpit of a luxury aircraft. So I projected that fear onto passengers who looked like they might not belong, trying to prove to myself that I had earned my place by denying it to others. That doesn't excuse what I did to you. Nothing excuses that. But I need you to know that your response to my behavior, the way you maintained your dignity while holding me accountable, taught me more about real strength than 22 years of flying ever did. I work in a warehouse now. I will probably never fly again, and I've accepted that consequence. But I'm also a different person than I was that day. I volunteer at a youth center in my community, talking to young people about the consequences of bias and the importance of treating everyone with respect. My children won't have to be proud of their father's career, but maybe they can be proud of the man I'm trying to become. I hope the changes you've made in the aviation industry prevent other people from experiencing what you experienced. And I hope that someday the name Jake Morrison is remembered not just for discrimination, but for what happened when discrimination was met with the kind of principled response that creates lasting change. Respectfully, Jake Morrison Zara had read the letter twice, then filed it away. Forgiveness was a process, not a single decision, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that particular journey yet. But she was grateful that Morrison seemed to understand the deeper implications of what had happened, that it hadn't just been about one passenger's bad experience, but about challenging structures that had enabled discrimination to flourish. The real testament to change, though, wasn't in Morrison's letter, or in congressional legislation, or in business school case studies. It was in the everyday experience of flying on Atlas Elite Airways where passengers were greeted as individuals deserving of respect rather than judged as members of demographic categories. It was in the smile on Maria Santos's face as she welcomed a young black woman onto the aircraft, ensuring that the passenger felt valued from the moment she stepped aboard. Maria had used her position to hire other flight attendants who understood that true hospitality meant seeing each passenger's humanity rather than making assumptions about their worthiness. It was in the confidence Roberto Vasquez displayed as he operated the aircraft with expertise that had nothing to do with his ethnicity and everything to do with his skill, professionalism, and commitment to safety. He had become a mentor to younger pilots, teaching them that excellence in aviation was measured by competence and character, not by fitting narrow stereotypes of what a captain should look like. It was in the quiet pride Brad Wilson felt as he performed pre-flight checks alongside diverse crew members who had been hired based on their qualifications rather than their connections or their similarity to existing staff. He had learned that true professional integrity meant speaking up for what was right even when it was difficult. But most importantly, it was in the knowledge that future passengers would never have to experience what Zara had experienced. Children flying alone would be treated with kindness regardless of their race. Business executives would be welcomed warmly regardless of their accent or appearance. Families celebrating milestones would be served with joy regardless of their economic background or cultural heritage. As the Gulfstream G700 approached Los Angeles, Zara reflected on how much had changed in 3 years. The aircraft was the same, the route was the same, even some of the crew members were the same. But the culture, the invisible but crucial atmosphere that determined how people treated each other, had been transformed. Ms. Mitchell. Sarah Kim's voice came through the intercom. "We're beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Thank you for flying with us today, and thank you for everything you've done to make our industry better." It wasn't part of the standard arrival announcement. It was personal, authentic, and exactly the kind of genuine human connection that had replaced the toxic hierarchy of Morrison's era. Zara smiled not with triumph, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to turn a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change. Gratitude for colleagues like Arthur, who had embraced transformation rather than defending the status quo. Gratitude for employees like Maria, Roberto, Sarah, and Brad, who had chosen to be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. And perhaps surprisingly, gratitude for Morrison himself. His behavior had been inexcusable, but it had also been illuminating. It had shown her exactly what needed to change, and had given her the platform to make that change happen. As the aircraft touched down smoothly in Los Angeles, a professional landing that reflected the pilot's respect for expensive equipment and passenger comfort, Zara knew that the real journey was just beginning. Changing culture was an ongoing process, not a destination. Each flight, each interaction, each moment when someone chose inclusion over exclusion was an opportunity to reinforce the values that made dignity possible. The Morrison incident had ended with handcuffs and headlines. But the real story was what came after the daily work of building an industry where everyone could travel with respect, where excellence was measured by character rather than appearance, and where the luxury of first-class service included the fundamental luxury of being treated as a human being deserving of dignity. That was Morrison's unwitting gift to the world. He had shown everyone exactly what change was needed. And Zara Mitchell had shown them that change was possible. The aircraft door opened to the California sunshine, and Zara stepped onto the tarmac, knowing that this arrival was different from the departure 3 years ago. Then she had been a passenger subjected to discrimination. Now she was a leader who had transformed discrimination into opportunity bias, into inclusion, and individual suffering into collective progress. The real luxury, she realized, wasn't in the leather seats or the champagne service or the private terminals. The real luxury was in the knowledge that every person who boarded her aircraft would be welcomed, valued, and treated with the respect that should be every person's birthright. That was a legacy worth building. That was change worth fighting for. And that was why the story would continue long after the headlines faded and the business school case studies were filed away. Because the most important transformations happen not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the daily moments when people choose to see each other's humanity rather than their differences. Captain Morrison had failed that test spectacularly, but his failure had created space for others to succeed, and in that success, justice had been served not just through punishment, but through progress. The impact of what became known as the Atlas Elite incident extended far beyond private aviation. Universities began requiring case study analysis of the event in courses ranging from business ethics to social psychology. The incident had become a teaching tool for understanding how individual actions could catalyze broad institutional change, and how quiet dignity in the face of discrimination could be more powerful than anger or retaliation. Dr. Patricia Williams, who taught leadership studies at Stanford Business School, used the case to help students understand the difference between reactive and transformative responses to injustice. Zara Mitchell could have simply fired Captain Morrison and moved on, she explained to her classes. Instead, she used the incident as evidence of deeper problems that required structural solutions. That's the difference between management and leadership. Maria Santos had become one of the most sought-after speakers at hospitality conferences worldwide. Her presentation. When economic security, conflicts with moral duty resonated with service industry workers who had faced similar impossible choices between keeping their jobs and speaking up for what was right. The training programs she developed had been implemented by hotel chains, luxury cruise lines, and even high-end retail establishments. The lesson isn't that employees should sacrifice their family's well-being for abstract principles, Maria would tell her audiences. The lesson is that companies need to create environments where doing the right thing doesn't require personal sacrifice. When good people feel they can't afford to be good, the structure is broken. Her daughter Sophia, now healthy after successful surgery covered by the enhanced health benefits Atlas Elite Airways provided to all employees, often accompanied Maria to speaking engagements. At age 12, Sophia had become an articulate advocate for workplace fairness understanding, in ways that children sometimes can. That fairness wasn't complicated. It just required adults to treat each other with kindness. Brad Wilson had found his voice as a pilot advocate for safety culture reform. His presentation to the International Air Transport Association on the hidden costs of toxic leadership had led to new industry standards for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. He had testified before Congress about how discriminatory work environments compromised safety by creating crews too afraid to speak up about anything from inappropriate passenger treatment to potential mechanical issues. When crew members are afraid to challenge authority about discrimination, Brad explained to lawmakers, they're also afraid to challenge authority about everything else. That makes flying less safe for everyone. Jake Morrison's story had taken a different trajectory. After his release from federal prison, he had indeed found work in a warehouse, but he had also become an unexpected voice for accountability and change. His speaking appearances at corporate diversity training sessions were uncomfortable for everyone involved, but undeniably powerful. I want to be very clear, Morrison would tell audiences of executives and managers. I'm not here as a reformed person seeking sympathy. I'm here as an example of what happens when bias goes unchecked for too long. I had 22 years to learn that my behavior was wrong, and I chose not to learn. Don't be me. His children, now college-aged, had initially been ashamed of their father's infamy. But over time they had found ways to use their experience constructively. His daughter Emma had majored in social justice studies and was working with organizations that trained young people to speak up against discrimination when they witnessed it. His son Michael had joined the military partly as a way to serve something larger than himself, partly to prove that the Morrison name could be associated with honor rather than prejudice. The changes in private aviation had spread to other luxury industries. High-end hotels began implementing Mitchell standards for guest services, ensuring that assumptions about guests' wealth or status didn't determine the quality of treatment they received. Exclusive restaurants and private clubs found themselves under scrutiny for discriminatory practices that had previously been overlooked or excused as maintaining standards. The legal precedent established by Morrison's conviction had made discrimination cases easier to prosecute across all industries. The Department of Justice had established a Civil Rights Division task force focused specifically on discrimination in luxury services, recognizing that bias in high-end establishments often went unchallenged because victims had fewer advocates and less public sympathy. The Morrison case raised questions that extended far beyond aviation. How often do we witness discrimination and stay silent because speaking up seems too risky or too difficult? The incident had shown that broad change was possible, but it required individuals willing to take personal risks for collective benefit. What assumptions do we make about people based on their appearance, and how do those assumptions affect the way we treat them? Morrison's downfall hadn't been his conscious racism as much as his unconscious biases that led him to make judgments about people's worth based on superficial characteristics. How do we balance personal economic security with moral responsibility? Maria Santos's dilemma had resonated with millions of workers who faced similar choices between keeping their jobs and doing what they knew was right. What role does individual courage play in creating institutional change? Zara Mitchell's response had shown that personal dignity could be a catalyst for broad reform, but only when combined with the power and resources to implement change. Despite the progress made since the Atlas elite incident, discrimination in various forms continued to challenge industries worldwide. The case had created awareness and accountability mechanisms, but changing deeply ingrained biases remained an ongoing process requiring constant vigilance. New challenges emerged as well. Social media's role in documenting and publicizing discrimination had created new pressures for accountability, but also new opportunities for misunderstanding and oversimplification of complex situations. The instant global nature of modern communication meant that incidents could become international news before all facts were known, creating both opportunities for justice and risks of unfair judgment. The aviation industry continued to grapple with diversity challenges despite the reforms implemented after Morrison's arrest. While discriminatory incidents had decreased significantly, the work of building truly inclusive cultures remained incomplete. Each new hire, each promotion decision, each customer interaction was an opportunity to either reinforce or challenge existing biases. The story of Zara Mitchell and Jake Morrison ultimately became a story about choice. Morrison had chosen to see differences as threats and used his authority to diminish others. Mitchell had chosen to see discrimination as an opportunity to create change and used her influence to elevate others. Every person who heard their story faced similar choices, though perhaps not as dramatically. The choice to speak up when witnessing unfairness, even when it was uncomfortable. The choice to treat people with respect, regardless of their appearance or assumed background. The choice to use whatever privilege or platform they possessed to create opportunities for others rather than to protect existing advantages. The incident had shown that change was possible, that individuals could challenge institutional biases, and that dignity in the face of discrimination could be more powerful than anger or retaliation. But it had also shown that change required more than good intentions. It required sustained commitment, structural reforms, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about bias and privilege. As Zara Mitchell often said in her speaking appearances, "The goal isn't to eliminate all bias immediately. That may be impossible. The goal is to create structures where bias has consequences, where dignity is protected, and where every person can expect to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. That's not just good business, it's the foundation of a just society. The Morrison case had become a landmark not just in aviation history, but in the ongoing American story of progress toward equality. It reminded everyone that justice wasn't a destination, but a journey, and that each generation had the responsibility to advance that journey for those who came after. In the end, the most important lesson wasn't about private jets or luxury travel. It was about the simple but powerful idea that every human being deserved dignity, respect, and the opportunity to be judged by their character rather than their appearance. That lesson remained as relevant and challenging as ever, waiting for each new generation to learn it, live it, and pass it on. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of quiet dignity in the face of injustice, then please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who need to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, courage, and the incredible transformations that happen when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wondered whether to speak up? Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments below. Let's build a community where everyone's voice matters and everyone's dignity is protected. Remember, change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when good people refuse to stay silent. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of the solution. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right.